Are we on? Good. Welcome to the Better Than Not podcast. Sometimes we get it right, sometimes we don't. But when we at least do something, we know it's almost always better than not. Hi there, and welcome to Better Than Not, the podcast that aims to capture shifting perspectives and thought-provoking ideas in conversation, which is based loosely on my Substack series, A Changing Frame of Reference, which I hope you'll take a look at as it might give you some insight into what this podcast is all about. I'm your host, Doug Gardam, and today it's a privilege and an honor to welcome Samuel Marusca. Samuel, how are you?
Hello, Doug. I'm very well, thank you. It's great to see you.
It's great to see you too. I'm excited about this today. Samuel is originally from Romania, but lives in the UK today. He is an academic. He's a civil servant who works in the British government. His interests include theology, history, linguistics, apologetics. He holds a PhD actually in linguistics. He's also writing a book about the 1917 Balfour Declaration, which we'll hear more about today, I'm sure. But where I first heard about Samuel was through his podcast. He's the host of Practical Wisdom. And you may know of this podcast, and I hope you do. I've certainly written about it a little bit in the articles of A Changing Frame of Reference. But I've talked both about Samuel as well as some of his notable guests. So Samuel, I'm very excited to have you here today. This is amazing.
I'm really excited about this conversation too. It's great to see you, Doug. And I just wanted to say I really appreciate all of your work. You're a published author, you're a prolific author, and published several books. I really think that your content is great, and all of your platforms are really, really interesting and engaging. And I'm just very encouraged by all of your work.
Well, thank you very much. I was going to say that feeling is very much mutual. I'm kind of thinking today, though, of the magic of our technology today, because you're in the UK, I'm in the west coast of Canada. We're 8 time zones apart. And this technology brings us together to have this kind of conversation to me, which is stunning. So, Samuel, there's so many things to kind of go on here. Is there anything that I kind of missed in how I introduced you that you'd kind of like to maybe share to start with? Because you have a very interesting background, and I was going to say your interests really are what sparked the whole podcast here with Better Than Not.
Oh, that's right, Doug. I think you were spot on. I think my interests, as you say, are around apologetics, history, and linguistics, but my passion lies in apologetics. And recently I started this little podcast called Practical Wisdom, which comes from Aristotle's saying practical wisdom in his Ethics, the idea that wisdom isn't just about knowledge, it's a moral quality, it's a moral judgment that comes from above, perhaps from God. And so I started this podcast last year where I have conversations, I call them conversations that matter, just like this one, with thinkers like John Lennox, Alistair McGrath, Dennis Dilettante, Christopher Wright, and many others around science and faith and how to best engage with the culture we live in.
No, I was going to say that is what has very much attracted me to your podcast, which I don't necessarily even know how I found it. But the fact is that somehow or other I did find it. I think it was in some ways, as we've spoken about, there's some divine stuff going on here that I may not even be aware of. But I thought when you mentioned apologetics, I liked this term, but I'm curious to how you would define it, because I hear it a lot and I have an understanding of it. I'm not sure that, because it has that word kind of apology in it, and I've heard kind of people talk about, well, you're apologizing for your beliefs. But how would you look at it with your interest in it, and how does it kind of, shall we say, capture what you think about and even talk about in your podcast?
That's exactly right, Doug. You mentioned apology. There's this misconception that apologetics is about being apologetic. Apologetics has nothing to do with being apologetic, but it is based on this word, the Greek word apologia, which in Greek means defense, giving a defense of your faith, just as you would give a defense of your thesis in front of a panel, for example, of a committee. This apologetics is giving a defense, an explanation, that is, of the Christian faith. So it comes from the Greek word apologia and doesn't have anything to do with being apologetic. It involves presenting rational arguments and evidence in context for the existence of God, and it defends the truth claims of Christianity. Apologetics is both for non-believers and believers in the sense that it is a tool to defend your faith and to engage with the culture and with your friends and people around you about your faith. And I think this method of doing theology, this branch of theology, is particularly interesting in Western Europe and in the United States, where we've become much more secular than 50, 60 years ago, or than South America or Eastern Europe, for instance, where you have much more religious, where countries are much more religious. So I think it's quite interesting that you have this method of engaging with the culture in a secular environment, and it's becoming increasingly useful. So it's about defending your faith, explaining your beliefs, and it can be also a persuading tool as well. But it's not just about building your confidence and your faith in Christ. It's also about explaining to atheist friends and agnostic friends who may not be believers, who may think that Jesus Christ is just a fairy tale, or compare God to Santa Claus, for instance,
Yes.
or the Greek gods. So it's really good to have this background and understand how to best articulate your reasons for believing in God. And I think there are various types of apologetics, and I'm not sure which view you would take, but there is at least four types of apologetics. For instance, fideism, which is the idea that based on fide, on faith, right?
Yes.
The idea that the biblical truth is based on faith, so it doesn't really matter if you have all of the right arguments to defend your faith. It's all about faith. And this is the view taken by Kierkegaard, for instance, or Karl Barth. So Kierkegaard was an existentialist, and he said we don't need to argue or defend our faith because this is more like blind faith. It's just a spiritual thing, and you either believe in God or not, and that's your personal belief. So that's faith.
Yes.
You have evidentialist apologetics, which is the idea that you need arguments. You need to bring arguments and support your claims with arguments, with proof, if possible. So it's based on reason as well. Some of the proponents of this view are Josh McDowell or William Paley. And you have presuppositional apologetics, the idea that the Christian truth is presupposed already. So you already presuppose that Christianity is true, and then you get proof for God. You need to bring evidence for God, but the evidence that you have for God doesn't make sense outside of Christianity. So it's all within Christianity. That's Carl Henry's view. And you have classical apologetics, which is what I tend to do. Basically, philosophical arguments for the existence of God and historical evidence for the existence of God that support Christianity. And you have people like C.S. Lewis, J.P. Morland, or Sproul, and others. So that's four ways in which you can approach apologetics, because you have this debate. You always get this debate that even in Christian circles, you find many people who say, faith is a belief in the things that you can't see. So that's the Hebrew definition of faith, which follows, therefore it follows that you don't need any proof for your faith. You don't need to explain your faith or rationalize your faith. It's just spiritual. There's the other view, which I hold, that and people like John Lennox, of course, C.S. Lewis, many others. Perhaps C.S. Lewis was the best apologist of the 20th century, who said uh, Christianity and faith in God makes sense. It's rational and it can be explained with arguments. And there is evidence for God in nature. There's the design argument from design, for instance. You have the teleological arguments. You have the fine-tuning
Yes.
cosmological
Yeah.
arguments, and so on. And you have all of these clues in nature. You have your own life. That's a preamble of something bigger than you,
Right.
of something that is to follow, that follows after this life. So there are some hints in nature, in the human body, in our
Oh, yes.
microcosm, in the universe, that there may be something beyond this. So this is the classical view of apologetics. And apologetics, all in all, is just about engaging with people and talking about your faith openly, respectfully, and in a way that engages with other cultures, other religions, and atheist arguments as well. It's really good to understand where atheists come from, because some of them come in good faith, as it were, and are willing to have an open debate
Yes.
about Christianity and about faith in general.
Well, and to me, I mean, as you've just described, and that was actually amazing. The idea is almost all encompassing. When I introduced you with your historical, your linguistics, your philosophical interests, apologetics captures like literally all of them. And this is I've been writing about this quite a bit recently, but you kind of hit right on a sensitive one for me. And this is the more I go down the science road, right? So you mentioned fine tuning, you mentioned design, even the human body as an example of how we come together. As I go down those they're pretty big rabbit holes actually, but they keep demonstrating that God thing, and it's kind of steps away from the faith perspective as you described. But one of the questions I was kind of like thinking of here was around where did the separation start to happen between science and God? Because when I'm going down these rabbit holes, all I keep going is they support God, not the evidence of God, the what it's about. Like you say, you see it in nature. You look at a flower, the intricacy is just stunning, right? Like that we cannot create. Not we can make images of through our arts, but we cannot make something grow and be alive like we see in a flower. So my question was that kind of came up over the weekend was how where did the separation start to take place? Because I read in Stephen C. Meyer's book Darwin's Doubt about this whole kind of movement. I'll say almost a doctrine after Darwin's Origin of Species came out, was this idea of methodological naturalism, which really began, unless it was natural or material, it was going to be excluded from science. So anything metaphysical, anything spiritual would just immediately be excluded. And I wondered is that where some of this started, where we started to say, well, you can believe in science, but if you believe in science, you can't believe in God, so to speak.
That's right. I think it started in the late 17th, 18th century with empiricism, with John Locke, Berkeley, Hume, for example, and others. The idea that everything that is a truth claim, all truth claims have to be proven empirically, through evidence, through perception, through all of your senses. If you can't see it, if you can't prove it, if you can't prove that you exist, it follows that if you don't have proof of that, if you don't have proof to show me, if you can't show me any evidence of your God, therefore it follows that God doesn't exist. And this was, as you say, also supported by Darwin later in the 19th century in
Right.
the UK, who revolutionized the idea of natural selection and found this mechanism in biology that explains natural selection and unguided, blind processes of how life evolved or changed throughout history. It doesn't explain one thing, though: the origin of life.
Yes.
And then following the 19th century, you have the early 20th century, in which this dichotomy perhaps became more prevalent, especially in Western Europe and the United States, that the idea that science and faith are antagonistic and reject each other. The idea that before, like 400 years ago, 500 years ago, 2000 years ago, when you had a solar eclipse, people would say that's something supernatural.
Yes.
That's a supernatural phenomenon. It's the gods, it's the deities, it's the god of Ra, or this other god, or demons, and so on. Whereas now that we can explain, we know exactly what happens during a solar eclipse. We know how the planets move and so on. We have the explanation. Therefore, we don't need God. So science pushes God out. Whereas some time ago, you had a priest to treat a depression. We now use a medication. We go to a psychiatrist to treat mental conditions, mental health conditions. You don't need a priest. You don't need to go to a priest or a pastor anymore.
Right.
If you have schizophrenia or epilepsy, we know that's not a curse of the gods or a supernatural spiritual power.
A demon.
We think,
Yes.
or a demon,
Yes,
exactly.
yes.
We know that person isn't possessed. We know they have schizophrenia or epilepsy, and if someone has a seizure, they just need to take their medication. So the more science developed, and the more we were able to discover, I say, not invent or explain, the more we're able to discover how things work. Newton, when he discovered the law of gravity,
Yes.
he didn't. Well, he was a Christian, by the way.
Yes.
And literally all historic scientists, like all scientists of modern, starting from modern science, doing modern science, were Christian. But when Newton talked about gravity, he first of all rejected the God of the gaps theory and didn't say, now I know how it works, I don't need God anymore. He said, what a wonderful God that did it this way.
Yes.
And Newton, in his Principia Mathematica, doesn't actually explain what gravity is. No one knows.
No, that's
no
right.
scientist can show what gravity is. They can just explain it. It's more like a taxonomy issue here. This is what science does. It explains things, and it taxonomizes things. It tells you, this is what we can observe. This is the observable universe. This is an observable law. But gravity, you see an apple fall that's attracted to the center of the earth. You can explain it through an equation,
Yes.
but you don't understand how it works, actually. We don't understand what it is.
Yes, exactly.
So science evolved in the last 200 years so much, to the extent that you have the school of logical positivism in the 1930s in Austria and Western Europe, that says propositions, truth claims, can be split into three categories. One, if you want to prove that something is true, you need to know that you can empirically verify it. Two,
Yes.
they can fall into formal categories, so statements of like logic or mathematical statements of the 2 + 2 = 4 type. And here I think many atheists think that Christianity and faith can be proven mathematically, and expect you to bring 2 + 2 = 4 type of evidence.
Yes.
For the resurrection, for example. It doesn't quite work that way.
No.
And three, you have metaphysical statements.
Yes.
So statements about aesthetics or about spiritual things. But they said all of these statements are nonsensical because you can't verify them. They cannot be proven mathematically or empirically. So if you can't say that, if you can't bring any evidence for your claims, you have claims without claims are not evidence theory, and they say these statements are nonsensical. so that you just disregard them. And that's what some philosophers in the early 1930s thought. That was refuted later on, but we had this idea that was developed by Karl Popper later on, a German philosopher. In the UK, he also taught in London. Karl Popper said that any truth claims need to be falsifiable. So you need to put them to test and be able to falsify it. If you can't do that, then it follows that that claim is unscientific, or it's not even false. It's just meaningless.
Right.
So we have this residual rationale in our culture in the West from logical positivism that anything that science cannot prove is wrong, it's false.
Right.
And many spiritual claims, like any claims about God, for example, or of a spiritual nature, will fall into that category. And so, although logical positivism isn't, nobody thinks about that anymore.
Right.
We still have in our culture this dichotomy that science refutes God, and science has buried God, as John Lennox put it.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, and I find it in different circles that you have conversations, it can be stronger than others. But I've just recently, with the things that I'm going down and discovering, I'm kind of saying this doesn't make sense. Like examples of this to me recently are things like you mentioned us as in people, human beings, and the fact that we're made up physically of everything that comes out of the earth. It's all off the periodic table, all the elements that make us up, which in many times when that breaks in the conversation, people are surprised. But then there's something that comes into us. I'm using the word something because when we're conceived, that something has the capability to take those materials, to grow those materials, first of all, in the womb for 9 months. But then when we're born, able to create and grow, giving this organism reasoning powers like and the senses, but it's still physically just those elements. But it's created that. It's allowed us to have this conversation today. And then it ends at some point, whether it's through tragedy or through natural causes. And that those materials return to the earth. That's scientific, that's physical. And whatever that something was that was inside us is gone. And it's the age-old question of what happens to that. And this is to me where, I mean, science is helping to demonstrate the existence of that God figure that created that spirit in the human part. And so that's why I'm curious. In fact, I'm writing some stuff on it right now because where did we kind of come up with it? And I think when you mentioned John Locke, that's another addition to it that makes sense. Samuel, this is a bit of a shift, but do you remember the first time that this type of discussion or this type of thinking struck you and you liked it and you kind of had a realization that this is fun, this is what I'm about? Do you have a recollection of, like, because you've spent a lot of time in the academic, your interests are obviously very thorough and reaching, but you must, or did you come to a recognition like this is what I'm about? Where do you like, because it probably expanded into even recently into your podcast, but as a younger person, do you remember when this kind of struck you?
When I was younger, I would watch the debates online and on TV with great new atheist proponents, so the four horsemen of atheism, as they're called,
Yes.
and great Christian thinkers, and I was fascinated by that philosophy as well, and theology in more broader terms. But it was a conversation I had with friends here in London some time ago, where we would discuss things like that, perhaps in a much more fiery fashion. And we thought to ourselves, this should be the show.
Oh.
This could be a show.
Okay.
This conversation could be a show. This is very interesting stuff. what if this was public? It's very difficult to capture the spontaneity that you
Yes.
have with people that you know in conversation. And I do think that communicating, whether it's your native tongue or a second language, as we do now, in my case, is more than just having a conversation or a
Yes.
chat. It's two spirits interacting about something that is fundamental to their lives,
Yes.
to them. It's not coincidental, and it has a meaning, and it could have a purpose. And it's discovering what that purpose is that brings purpose and meaning to that relationship, to that conversation. And I realized that I learn a lot from my guests and from the people that
Oh, yes.
I speak to, and I'm feeding on their wisdom, as it were, which is what makes me what makes it so interesting. So it was, I think, that idea, that feeling that this conversation could be there's something valuable in these interactions, and then I decided to speak to people that I knew, and that's how I started the little podcast, Practical Wisdom, with a friend, interviewing a friend on camera. So that's where I got this idea from. It's I think really interesting. It's great. I really enjoy it. I love it, and I do hope to grow the platform. But I wanted to go back to, if I may, to one
Sure.
of your points that you made about our organisms, our living
Yes.
organisms,
Yes.
life, and the beginning of life, because that's a really deep question. It's quite important. Don't want to overlook that. But Richard Dawkins made this point in his book, The God Delusion,
Hmm.
and said, science will eventually explain everything. And there is, in biology, you have the Darwinian theory of evolution
Yes.
and natural processes. And again, it's about how life transforms and how life evolved throughout history. So that's the beginning of life. It's not how life came about,
Yes. Yes.
which is something that science hasn't proven yet, but it was a revolutionary idea, the way that life evolves in
Hmm.
various
Hmm.
organisms. And he said, science will eventually explain and answer all of the questions that we can't answer just now. The only problem is that it hasn't explained, or there's no equal counterpart of Darwinian theory in physics.
Hmm.
So you have the 20th
Interesting.
century where people talk about relativity theory and quantum mechanics. There's
Yes.
this debate between in physics between quantum mechanics and the theory of relativity, but there isn't a comparable work to Darwin's in
Hmm.
physics, and physics doesn't and cannot explain the origin of life and the origins of the universe until the Big Bang theory
Right.
came about. So we had the Hubble telescope was able to, we were able to develop better lenses and to literally look
Farther back.
further back into our universe,
Oh,
and discovered that the furthest back you can look to is some 14 billion
yes.
light years. That's the furthest you can look. So that might be the when the universe began. So in physics, you have arguments, you have scientific proof of the Big Bang, which was an interesting name,
Hmm.
a pejorative term.
Yes.
That an interesting name, a funny name to say that the universe had a beginning.
Yes.
And when actually this theory came about, physicists didn't want to popularize this idea because they thought it would, if anything, support the Genesis claims
Yes.
and the Genesis account of the creation, the idea that the universe had a beginning. Before
Yes.
that, you had the Aristotelian view
Yep.
that the universe was always around. The universe is infinite and timeless until the 20th century. So, like I said, although we had the Darwinian theory of evolution, which is now being questioned in
Hmm.
scientific and atheist circles as well, you don't have a comparable work in physics. except the Big Bang Theory, which proves the Genesis
Right.
creation account.
Well, didn't it like in some of my reading, it caused almost a split in the science, if not the physics community, because as you said, we can't have that. I liked how you said kind of a pejorative term. I haven't actually heard it expressed that way, but in many ways, that's how it was looked at. And the sense that, well, now we're siding with the Bible in Genesis 1, right? As you said, right? And as I'm recently been understanding, that was a pretty big deal, and a lot of argument kind of separated science and that on those two things, right? Because I think one of your guests, John Lennox, I like to say as a mathematician, because I have to quote him. I didn't come up with this, but he says, if you're a mathematician, you believe in the intelligibility of the universe. Well, that is an interesting, to me, comment when you look at everything from a science perspective, because it does fit together remarkably well, right? And and that comes back to the question you said about not really we can see like them being able to tell what, as science can tell what the elements in our make up our body, but we can't tell why. Like why does that happen? Why does it all fit together as so remarkably it does? And to me, that's where this idea of intelligibility kind of comes from. So it's very interesting to me as far as how that all fits together. And that's why I think it's really interesting how you kind of explained that, because I think it's an important point that I think we need to be almost a louder voice about, is that science is not disproving it. It's actually demonstrating that there is a God. And where we have elements that don't fit that, we should start to kind of reckon with them. So and in that reckoning, when you hear a quote like, eventually science will prove everything, right? That's what you'd said that was in the God Delusion. I'm intrigued by that, because I think when Darwin, so I'm going to give you the example from the Darwin's doubt that I didn't know anything about, and this is the Cambrian explosion, of course, and the animals that came about that we've never been able to find pre-fossils on. And I understand, as legend has it, Darwin's, because he knew about it, it was during his time and before, he said we just haven't found them yet. And so I think Meyer's book really goes on exposing to what level we're going to prove from a science perspective that it fits into an evolutionary form, which I think is beginning to really fall apart, so to speak, as you mentioned already. But when we have these gigantic claims, it's easy to say, well, eventually science will prove everything. I don't think we recognize like how easy it is to say that, and how almost infinitely incorrect it is.
Show me your fossils and I'll show you mine, says the title of a book, of a very popular book. You have Bones of Contention as
Yes.
well, another one. But I think Stephen Meyer's book is great in that it refutes these arguments, because there simply isn't enough proof of these fossils, as you say. But to go to your first point that you made about the intelligibility of the universe,
Yes.
I think that's really essential. Imagine that there's meaning, there's meaning in this universe, and somehow all of this matter came together to form the planets. That's how planets were formed. You
Yes.
have the stars. You have the planets that evolve around the stars, and they have satellites. And then out of this dust, somehow, came life. And this life developed through history. I don't know in terms of timescale how long it took, like from the first microorganism, first form of life, to develop into humans.
Mm-hmm.
And then this speck of dust called a human is able to understand and question
Yeah.
its very existence and the very existence of the universe from which it came. So I think it's the idea of meaning as well. Ogden and Richards, they are two philosophers in the early 20th century who wrote a book. It's called The Meaning of Meaning. It's exactly 100 years ago. They devised a meaning triangle, the triangle of reference, it's called. And there's symbol, referent, and thought or reference at the top. So you have this triangle that gives you meaning. So the symbol could be the actual tree, for example, in reality. The symbol is the written word. That's
Yes.
the sign, the linguistic sign that you have. The referent could be the reality, the actual tree in front of you, and you have the thought at the top, or reference. That's the idea that you have in your thought. That's all about language. So there is semantics. Language is intelligible because it has a design. It has someone who transmits that signal. It has an originator.
Mm-hmm.
And C.S. Lewis put it nicely. He said, "I believe that the universe has a law and follows a law because it requires a lawgiver." So there is, if you have if you have laws, natural laws, it follows that there is also a lawgiver as
Mm-hmm.
well. So there's the idea of meaning. I think that's quite interesting. Meaning in
Yes.
terms of biology, in terms of philosophy, linguistics, and data. So there's, I think, three different strands here. The cell is a complex microcosm,
Yes.
and we're nowhere near
Oh,
to create a single cell. That's life, a living cell. We're nowhere near to that,
yes.
and that's what people like Stephen Meyer say, and Dr. Toole and Hugh Ross and many others. The cell is so
Oh,
complex, it's such a complex organism that it's just impossible for us, just at least for now, to create that. But all these cells and our DNA has information in it. It has meaning.
oh, yes.
All of this life has meaning. Just as data and information, and this is something that you pointed out more recently that John Lennox talks about, the idea that information is a category
Yes.
which is a semantic category as well.
Yes.
So it has meaning, and all of these categories, right, biological, philosophical, and linguistic, and data categories, they all point to intelligent design.
Yes.
You have to have an originator.
Yes.
You have to have someone who encodes something for you to understand, which makes your brain to understand and decode that. For you to say, yes, I understand what this means. You know, this word means, I don't know, exit, for instance. You know what it means. It's just
Right.
letters there, but you know what it means because you know the alphabet. You speak the language, that language. If you didn't speak the language, it wouldn't have meaning. That's another
Yes.
interesting point. If you don't see something that exists as real, does it then exist?
Right.
So if you don't understand the meaning of something, does it mean that it doesn't have meaning because you don't speak the language?
Yeah.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. It still has meaning. So I think it's the idea of the intelligibility of the universe that can't be overstated. That's often overlooked.
Well, I think to what you're saying, and it's kind of like science years ago. I think it was the 1820s when the second law of thermodynamics was described, and it doesn't allow, like, as time goes on, more disorder happens, not less. So that intelligibility for, as you just described, about the stars and everything fitting together, it doesn't become more organized over time. It goes the other way around. And yet you look at the human, I mean, just the miracle of life itself, the complexity, the, like you mentioned, DNA, like just the level to which that goes. And I mean, there's the physical part that's stunning, but then there's the unseen part that is equally stunning, from our emotions, from, I mean, we haven't spoken of, but I know we can go down this rabbit hole deeply, but even the unconscious, like it's just like a third of our lives is spent in a place where it's
including language,
absolutely, absolutely.
including language, which is most of it is unconscious. So you're not aware of the
It's unbelievable.
processes that go on in your brain that make you say this word instead of another word.
I know.
What are the processes that go on in your brain to make your tongue move in such a way to produce this word as opposed to another word? It's unconscious, so all of that process is internal. Almost all of the language is internal to the mind, and we don't have access into it. And language and thought, many will say that are the same thing.
Yes, yes,
Although
yes.
some argue this Fodor, for instance, a philosopher who
Yes.
argued that there's also such a thing as the language of thought, that we think in a different language, in a language of
Yes.
thought, rather than in our own native language, native tongue. So language and thought were always thought to be the same thing. So to go back to your point on the unconscious, we usually say, "I see what you mean," because sometimes we can't understand what
Yes.
people mean,
Yes.
and we use these ways of saying that. But most of the language is internal to the mind, and we don't have access to what goes on in our mind when we express our
Yes.
emotions, which is why poets find it so difficult, and so they find so beautiful ways of expressing feelings about love or hatred or pride or passion or something else. So expressing yourself and sharpening your thoughts is like putting a pencil through a pencil sharpener and then writing with that pencil on a piece of paper. I think that's probably
Oh, that's a neat metaphor. I
what
like that.
what your thoughts what your thoughts
Yes.
are in raw form, as opposed to what comes across when you speak, when you say something to a person, which would be perhaps the writing on a paper.
And it's interesting when you say that, because for that expression to take place, someone else has to interpret it or take it in. And the fact that some does and some doesn't, right, is kind of an amazing thing to me. You've prompted me another thing. Are you familiar with Cormac McCarthy, the late Cormac McCarthy?
Yes.
So he was a fellow at the Santa Fe Institute, and I kind of got interested in him late. But he wrote this, I'll call it, essay called the Kukuli Problem,
Mm.
and in it, it's very interesting. But it leads us, because his kind of thesis was that language came to us in order to help us better understand the unconscious. He put out the claim that 5,000 other mammals on the earth have no language, and they communicate quite well. I couldn't help but think of the Tower of Babel story, of course, here. But it's to me a very interesting when we go down that path, which I'm going to save for another chat, because we could spend the whole time talking about that. But it was very interesting because he's a fiction author, and he was
Mm.
writing a nonfiction science essay, which was very intriguing to me. But I've got to tell you a little story that happened over the weekend. So you're writing. I'm sure we're okay to talk a little bit about what you're writing about, right? Because it's a
Absolutely.
fascinating subject. So
It
as I
is. It is.
as I introduced Samuel today, he talked about working on a book about the 1917 Balfour Declaration. So some of this kind of was fuzzy in my head. And so, believe it or not, I go to one of my history experts, which is my father, and I told him about this and yourself. And he expanded on it like I couldn't believe, because he started I'm going to turn this over to you in a second, but I was so surprised. He talked about Moses Gaster, um, who you described quite a bit when we talked previously. And I thought, oh my goodness, I have to tell Samuel this because I had no idea. And he's very excited about you coming on this podcast because he thinks there's a big explanation about where we are in our world today with regards to what went on and the decisions that were made. So that's a little bit of a preamble to what you're about with this book, because many, I'm sure, are kind of like me. It might be fuzzy. They might not know much about it, but there is definitely things in that the repercussions of that we're still feeling today, and we read about every day on the news, it seems.
Absolutely. Well, that's really interesting that your father was familiar with Moses Guster,
Oh,
because Moses Guster is a Zionist figure that's forgotten in historic circles today. The 1917 Balfour Declaration was a very short document, a 60, 70 word letter, very brief letter, written by the British government, by Lord Balfour, addressed to Lord Rothschild, who was the leader of the Zionist movement in British government, in which the British government pledged allegiance to the Jewish people, the Jewish communities, that they will support them to establish a national home in Palestine, in the Holy Land of Palestine of the time, in November 1917, at a time when Great Britain and the Allied powers were losing the war after the Battle of Somme and many, many other battles after a long trench war in 1916 and 17. And so they negotiated with the Jewish leaders and the Zionist leaders in Great Britain. And the Zionist leaders were Herbert Samuels, who was a British government official, Chaim Weizmann, who was the lead
mm-hmm.
negotiator of the Zionist movement, and Moses Gaster, who was co-negotiating with Chaim Weizmann. They were both negotiating the declaration for the Jewish people, and they really wanted to establish themselves in the Holy Land, in
Could
Jerusalem, in Palestine.
could you maybe I'll say define a little bit of this Zionist movement that you just spoke of, like even Zionism, if maybe expand on that a little bit.
It's a very it's a very slippery word. I
Yes.
think Zionism can mean so many things to so many people. It usually has a negative connotation today, but in 1917, for the Zionist leaders, it simply meant this deep desire to fulfill for Christians, it meant that the Jewish people could fulfill the Old Testament prophecies, to return the Isaiah prophecies, to return to the Holy Land.
Yes.
And this is a movement that took place in the second half of the 19th century. We had Lord Salisbury in the British government, who was a proponent of this view, and of course the Jewish people, who were scattered throughout their diaspora. Diaspora means, in Greek, it means scattered throughout the world,
Mm-hmm.
scattered. So the Jewish people who were scattered across the world have long wanted to achieve this goal. They have long dreamt of returning back to Jerusalem, to the Holy
Right.
Land, to the holy site. They're offered through the Uganda scheme in 1903. They were offered Uganda because there were so many pogroms, especially in Eastern Europe and Russia. They were attested, where the Jewish communities would die by the thousands in a day. They would be executed, sadly, because of so many pogroms in the East, in Eastern Europe. The British government offered Uganda as a safe haven for the Jewish communities to go to and to take refuge temporarily. There was a big debate between Theodor Herzl, the leader of the Zionist organization, and other Zionist leaders who actually were inclined to accept, but in the end decided to reject the offer, as they wanted the Holy Land. And so Zionist leaders simply wanted to return to Jerusalem, and to the Holy Land that they thought belonged to the Jewish people since biblical times. There were only 9,000 Zionists in the UK, the United Kingdom, at the time, during the First World War, and the total population of the Jews in the UK was 300,000. A very large Jewish community that has been in the UK for centuries and flourished. In fact, the UK was probably the country that treated them best.
Okay.
All historians agree that Jewish communities thrived in the UK, and therefore very few Jewish people would want to return to a barren, arid
Right.
desert
Yes.
in a land occupied by the Ottoman Empire that was Muslim for 400 years. But the Zionist leaders managed to convince the British government that they would support them and help them win the war and bring the United States into the war, the Vatican, they would have the support of the Vatican and Russia, interestingly, if they were given the Holy Land. And so the government, through various negotiations with Chaim Weizmann and Moses Gaster, decided to grant them this under Prime Minister David Lloyd George and Foreign Secretary Lord Balfour in 1917. And Chaim Weizmann, who was the main negotiator of the declaration, later became the first president of Israel in 1948, whereas Moses Gaster was perhaps one of the most prominent figures at the time and an amazing leader, very respected linguist and intellectual at the time. And the Balfour Declaration was first drafted in his home in Maida Vale. He was born in Romania, in Eastern Europe, and was a highly influential intellectual. Wrote a lot about folklore and tradition and folk tales, and he discovered that there were so many similarities in folklores and folk tales in Eastern Europe, and we basically had the same stories all over Europe for 500 years, same myths, which is a very interesting idea. He
Yes.
was banished by the Romanian anti-Semitic government, Brătianu, in 1885, and that's how he took refuge. He sought refuge in the UK, where he became the chief rabbi of the UK of the Sephardic community. So the declaration was it was drafted in his home in Maida Vale here in London, and he is a very prominent figure that's perhaps not very well known in historic circles.
No, I was going to say, I was surprised when I'd spoken about it to my father, and he knew so much about it. So, what brought you to an interest in this? Because in many ways, it's a pretty topical subject today. And you probably started this a number of years ago. What brought you to this interest? And having written books, I know that it almost has to consume you in order to go through that. And obviously, with your explanation, which to me helps to understand and paint the picture of what's going on historically. What grabbed you in this? Do you remember?
Doug, if you want to master a subject and to really own it and understand it, you need to teach it. If you can't teach about the subject.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
You
No,
should
that
write about it. And
I
if you
was going to
do
say.
that, you'll probably master that subject. You'll learn a lot. So I thought to myself, rather than just study this thing, why not simply write about it, which is an interesting thought. And I first came across Moses Gaster during my linguistics studies, my linguistic work,
Right.
because he wrote a PhD in linguistics at the University of Leipzig in 1876. It's a 30-page book about the phonetics of Romanian, the Romanian language. So that's how I first came across this guy. And then later on found that he was involved with so many British politicians and British intellectuals, and then his work on Zionism in early 20th century England. So that's how I first came across him. And I just have a passion for the history of Israel. And as an evangelical, many evangelicals have an affinity to Israel and to the Jewish culture
Mm-hmm.
because of what some people may call Christian Zionism. This current that was prevalent in the 19th century Britain. The idea, like I said, that the prophecies need to be fulfilled and were fulfilled with the creation, partly fulfilled with the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. And also all of the main architects of the Balfour Declaration, such as Lord Balfour, David Lloyd George, American President Wilson,
Mm-hmm.
and many others, were from an evangelical background. Hence, there's a lot of evangelical support
Yes.
for the Jewish culture and for Israel in more broader terms. But it's just an interest that I had. And like I said, I wanted to deepen this subject a bit further and decided to write about it. And the more I read about Zionism and about the
Oh.
Jewish culture and history, the more I realized that it explains a lot of things that happen today, and it just gives you another flavor of the history of Israel, the state of Israel, that just helps you understand what goes on in the world a little bit better, and also the Jewish culture as well. So that's one of my interests, one of my current interests.
I look forward very much to this book, like because something that's explaining that idea today is really, I think, is really necessary because it just literally dominates our news channels, and I think it's something that is probably understandable, but the way it's presented today is very difficult to understand. In fact, it seems to be more an effort around choosing what team to be on than it is about really understanding what the, shall we say, the beginning or the source of what that's about and why it is so important to many people in the world. And as you've described this book so far, it's very intriguing. It's funny because we've talked about Tom Holland as well,
Mm.
not Spider-Man. This is the historian Tom Holland, and his latest book, Dominion, which I was reading the other night, and he was kind of doing the definition on evangelical from the Greek. I'm going to get the word wrong. You would know the Greek word to that, but how relational that was to that whole process, like 2,000 years ago. It was like, it's quite remarkable what he's uncovering in this book to me, which in many ways, I think is helping us to understand. I don't know why. That's why I asked you the question of what brought this on to you, because I don't know why this is suddenly such a big intrigue to me. And I don't just mean the idea of Israel and Jerusalem and the Holy Land, but I mean this push to understand things in a more complete way. And I think part of it is because of my engineering science background. I had separated them for so long. Like, I didn't think that they were like congruent. And I'm now found instead that they're more than congruent. And how do you kind of bring them back together? And I think that your book will be an important ingredient to that understanding to me, because you can't understand a number of these things to me, like we said earlier on about science being, you used the word antagonist to God, which I love the way that you described that, without understanding some of these deeper meanings to our history. and the formulation. And that's, to me, why the Bible becomes so important to all of this, and why I was so impressed with, I'll say, the evangelical approach. And I don't know whether this is evangelical or not, but certainly the church that we attend focus on Scripture and the story. I remember a while back, because we've talked about Jordan Peterson, and he was one of the first person that I can recall saying in his lecture series, the psychology of the biblical stories, that the Bible has a plot. Because I'd almost always seen it as almost as a story of a bunch of quotes that were not necessarily connected in a bunch of books. Can you comment on that at all? Of how you kind of view that?
The Bible definitely has the most interesting and robust plot ever that is actually found in all subsequent books and works of art and literature, where you have the human being, and you have that conflict in the Garden of Eden. You then
Yes.
have a fall, and then you have on that structure, within the Old Testament narrative, that brings the expectation and brings forth the arrival of Jesus Christ, who comes into that story.
Yes.
And you have his suffering and death and redemption. And then after that, you have the redemption of man, the sinful nature of man.
Yes.
And then you have a new creation. So that's the plot of the Bible. And Chris Wright has an interesting view of this, where he talks about the Bible in 7 acts, like 7 stages, of
Okay.
like
Okay. Yeah.
levels or
Yep.
layers of the plot of the Bible narrative, in which Jesus Christ plays the central role, following the Old Testament prophecies. And he talks about what that means, and what fulfilling a prophecy means as well. So the Bible, this is the plot of the Bible. It's the most beautiful plot, and there's something in this story that's essential, Doug, and that's
Yes.
hope. The hope
Yes. Yes.
of redemption, and the hope of a new creation and a new life. And Viktor Frankl, who was at Auschwitz, an author and psychologist who wrote about his experience at
Unbelievable.
Auschwitz. He talked about the Holocaust and the psychology of the people who were there, and he said there was an instance when one of my friends had a nightmare,
I love this story.
and he was twitching and screaming in his sleep, and I was sitting next to him and wanted to wake him up, to put him out of his misery. But then it dawned on me that if I did wake him up, he would wake up to a reality that is far worse than his nightmare. So he decided not to wake him up. And he said, there's meaning in this tragedy,
Yes.
and there can be meaning in pain and in suffering. And he wrote a book, A Man's Quest for Meaning.
Yes.
And in the book, he talks about how tragedy, trauma, childhood trauma, and I think all of us have some sort of trauma in our
Yes.
lives. And I mentioned in a previous conversation that psychologists say if you have just the right amount of trauma as a child, it can help you achieve greater things in life, because it pushes you to into that. But he said there is hope in this pain.
Yes.
And if you find meaning, if you discover what that meaning is in all of that suffering around you, and what is the meaning of dying in a prison camp, it's really hard to find that. Sometimes you only find what the meaning is once you've been through that valley of death.
Yes.
Once you have been through that experience. And he said, the people who survived the Holocaust and the concentration camps were heroes, but they didn't
Absolutely.
do anything heroic.
Right.
They simply lived through that nightmare and managed to live to tell the story. So that in itself is a victory. So seeing your tragedy and your pain or your suffering as a victory changes your perspective and adds meaning to it. But discovering what that meaning is very difficult. And discovering what your meaning in life is very difficult. And some people live all their lives without knowing,
Right.
what is the purpose? What is the purpose of my life? What is
Yeah.
the purpose here? And he talks about hope. And he said the meaning is hope. It has to be linked to hope. And this is what all Christians who lived through Auschwitz had in common. They all had hope.
Yeah.
And he found something very interesting. He found that Christians that were at Auschwitz and in all concentration camps had a higher rate of survival than people who didn't have any faith at all.
Interesting.
Because they had hope.
Yes.
And in terms of meaning, I really like this analogy from physics. In physics, you have a resonant frequency. All objects are they either vibrate or they don't vibrate.
Yep.
So a glass, for instance, or a cup, if you hit a glass, it will vibrate, and it vibrates at a certain frequency, maybe 300, 400 hertz. And if the voice of a soprano hits that exact frequency, that exact note, at 400 hertz, for instance, it will start vibrating. And then the human voice can make the glass vibrate without touching it by simply hitting that frequency. And it's achieving that frequency that makes the other object resonate. And I think it's the same with meaning, Doug.
Yes.
When you hit that frequency,
yes,
where you feel that, where you know that this is what you're meant to be, this is what you're meant to become, this is where you're the most useful. This is where you've got the most impact in other people's lives. This is what you enjoy doing. I think achieving that frequency means that you've achieved the meaning. You understand what the meaning is in your life. And I really like the Esther story, the book of Esther.
Yes.
Where Mordecai sends Esther to the royal court, and she becomes empress, right? Mm-hmm. The king Ahasuerus marries her, and there's this person at the royal court who gives out this decree, hey man, and he says this decree means that all of the Jewish people will be killed in a number of weeks. And Mordecai says, we're all fasting now. We all want to fast for 3 days, but we need some support. So he goes to Esther, who is the empress, as it were, and he's seeking help, and he's asking her, can you help us? This is what's going to happen. You're also Jewish, but the king doesn't know it. You need to tell him, because you're the only one who can save us. And Esther says, actually, there's nothing I can do, because there's some rules at the royal household, and I'm not in the king's chambers. I'm in the female palace, where I need to submit an application first to seek to get an audience with the king, and then the king needs to send me to show his scepter, and that will be a sign that I'm allowed to go into a conference with the king, into an audience with the king. And then Mordecai says to her, you think you're going to escape this. You can't escape this. You're one of us. And then he says something amazing. And he tells her, what if God put you there for exactly this moment? So it could be that your whole life boils down to this very moment. This is the meaning of your life, actually, in a way. And he tells her, this is your time. This is your time to show what you're made of. So Esther, sure enough, gets the audience to the king with the king, and changes all the situation, and all of the Jewish people are spared. Hence, we have the Purim celebrations in the Jewish culture. So, in terms of the meaning of life and hope, I think they're both connected. And I think it's that hope gives you meaning.
There's no question, and you know we're I think we're getting close to the end. This is a very neat way of being described, but I can't stop this without connecting this to one of your episodes where you talked about, because we haven't talked about C.S. Lewis very much, and I find the more I read of C.S. Lewis, Screwtape Letters has become one of my favorite books. I cannot believe that one man could put that kind of story, but also that perspective and reflection on ourselves in such a manner. It's just, to me, it's spectacular. But in the podcast, you were talking with Alistair McGrath, and who's a known biographer of Lewis, and you were talking about pain, which this is, I think, where you talked about the Dostoevsky story as well as the Viktor Frankl. And what I thought was so beautiful about this podcast was the explanation, because Lewis wrote an early book on pain and a later book on pain. One kind of an intellectual book on what pain was about. The second being, I'm having pain. And I think we can intellectualize pain to a great extent, but when you're in pain, it changes who you are. And how you described it in that podcast, where you said, why me, as an example, and that being the wrong question, or asking the wrong question. And more so because generally in life, we can't go through it without pain. And what came out of it was how to better deal with it. Like, rather than saying, why me, and saying, oh, like, just eliminate it, don't have pain in my life at all. And pain can come in very many, like the Esther story talks about that in many ways. This was in many ways, a very painful story of anguish of a people. And how you kind of put it together with Alistair, to me, just came out in a very beautiful way of saying, like, we have to find better ways to deal with it. I think in this, we were talking about Lewis because after Screwtape, he became very famous, and he felt he struggled with pride, and how it affected him in, like, some say pride is the top sin, so to speak, right? It destroys you, I think, was how he explained it. And it caused him enormous pain as well. And I just thought how you brought those together, because I thought we want to eliminate these things, but we can't eliminate them. And it came out in the Viktor Frankl book, I think, as well, was the fact that when you're thinking, I'm going to be out by Christmas, and then I'm not out by Christmas, it's devastating, right? And sometimes when maybe our prayers aren't answered, we're devastated. And I just loved how you came out of that podcast with this idea of how should we better learn to deal with this, not eliminate it. Like, we can't be happy all the time. So
exactly.
how do we deal with it? Can you maybe just share a little bit from that perspective on your idea of what Lewis had to say with regards to that? Because I think that was beautiful how you put it together.
That's right, Doug. We always ask, why me? Why me when we go through pain? But we never ask, why me when we're successful or when we're on the heights of success. C.S. Lewis, as you said, wrote 2 books about pain. The first one is The Problem of Pain, which is more academic, more intellectual. He was commissioned to write that book. And the second one is A Grief Observed Following the Death of His Wife. He talked about pain from the depth of his heart. And that's a very personal, it's an extraordinary book, a very short book as well, in which he talks about his grief and his pain. I think you need to recognize that pain is part of life, and that the pain or going through pain doesn't reject the existence of God. When you think about that, evil, suffering, the problem of pain, and atheists, this is perhaps the hardest one for Christians to argue. You can't really argue this, but it's the idea that suffering and pain prove that God doesn't exist. But we just assume that a loving God wouldn't allow pain. But there are some instances in which God allows pain and evil, and there are various ways in which that happens and evil happens. One of them is natural evil. For example, it's evil that's created by us. If we don't care about the environment and our nature, then we shouldn't be surprised that there are floods. If there's so much deforestation, why are we surprised of floods, for example, or natural disasters? Some of them are created by us, of course, but there are other ones. And there are so many intellectuals, so many public figures who talk about this. Why does God allow a child to have cancer? Why did God allow the Holocaust? What is the purpose of that? There isn't any. There isn't any. No Christian can argue, or can say to a dying child, to a child who's perhaps has a medical condition. No Christian can say to their parents, somehow this fits within a larger purpose, within a bigger picture, and this is just part of that, and you need to accept that. No parent will accept that, and I would never say that. I would first of all recognize that pain is a part of life. I would see pain as a wake-up call, and this is what Lewis famously writes in The Problem of Pain. He says that God whispers in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. So pain can be a wake-up call as well. And it can be a mean of awakening us to our need for God. So pain, I think, we can't explain away pain. It's a reality of life. The only thing that we can gain from it, I think, is wisdom. And it's wisdom about who we are and what we become, because pain transforms us, and we have certain experiences that are transformative. And often it is through pain and suffering that our character comes to life, and our true colors, as it were, are shown. So wisdom, I think, is something we can gain from pain. And I always think that pain and suffering are a result of the reality of the free will. God created us with a will to, and this is debatable, of course, but God created us as free human beings. We have agency over certain things, and as a result, this is a fallen world. And in this fallen world, we are bound to have pain, a lot of pain. Some of it is inflicted by even ourselves.
Yes.
For instance, like you can think about the HIV virus or drugs, for instance, or that's just self-inflicting pain. But there is pain that just is, and I think we just need to find a way of relying on God and looking at Jesus Christ, who is perhaps the best way to deal with pain, knowing that Jesus Christ did suffer pain, not for his sins, not because he was sinful, but he suffered and he went through the valley of the death and death itself for our sake. And I think looking at him gives us comfort, and having hope that there is something after pain. There's a sun, there's a silver shining after any pain, I think should give us hope. And also the fact that we may become wiser and perhaps sharper diamonds in the process, I think is also important.
Beautiful. Well, I that was a great way to summarize that. I think hope is enormous, Samuel, and I think you've given very elegant words for able to describe that. So thank you. I was going to say, I think we're at the end. I think this is the beginning of many. I'm very, very, like I said at the beginning, been very excited about this chat that we were going to have. And may there be many more, because there's many subjects we only touched on today. So, but with that, anything else that you would like to conclude with today, Samuel?
I think, as you say, I think this was really interesting. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I'd love to speak to you again. I do hope to stay in touch, and I think there's a way we can work together. And there's quite a bit of synergy between our ministries, what I do at Practical Wisdom, and what you do. All of the great work that you do in your publishing work online and with your podcast.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. So, with that, I hope you've enjoyed this conversation with Samuel Marusca. Hopefully, you will connect up with his Practical Wisdom podcast, and for sure see his book when it comes out next year, or when he finishes it, on the Balfour Declaration. With that, Samuel, if you could stay on for a minute, we'll end. And thanks again for joining us. Until next time, this is Doug Gardner signing off from Better Than Not. Are we on? Good. Welcome to the Better Than Not podcast. Sometimes we get it right, sometimes we don't. But when we at least do something, we know it's almost always better than not.